a morning that divided time. There is a specific kind of silence that follows irreversible change. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of rest. The silence of a world trying to process something it does not yet have the vocabulary to describe. On a Tuesday morning in September 2001, the global order that had been carefully, imperfectly, constructed over the second half of the 20th century shifted. In the hours, days, and years that followed, governments rewrote laws. Borders tightened. Wars began. Intelligence agencies expanded beyond anything their founders had imagined. The word terrorism moved from the margins of foreign policy into the center of international life. At the center of all of it, one man, one organization, one ideology. But how do you explain that man? How do you trace the path from a wealthy child in a Saudi city, educated in religious schools, raised in comfort, to the architect of the most consequential terrorist attack in modern history? That is what this documentary will attempt to do. Not to sensationalize, not to mythologize, but to understand. Because understanding how something like this happens, the ideology, the organization, the strategy, the global failures that allowed it, is the only way to honestly reckon with what it produced. To understand Osama bin Laden, you have to begin where almost no one begins. Not in a training camp, not in a cave in the mountains, but in one of the most prosperous business families in the Middle East. Osama bin Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957, in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. His father, Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden, was a Yemeni immigrant who had built one of the most powerful construction companies in the Arab world, the Saudi bin Laden Group. By the time Osama was born, the family was embedded at the very heart of the Saudi state. The bin Laden Group held contracts to renovate and expand the holiest sites in Islam, the Grand Mosque in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. These were not simply commercial arrangements. They represented a fusion of religious prestige and political access that would shape how the young Osama understood power, faith, and legitimacy. Muhammad bin Laden was a patriarch in every sense of the word. He had multiple wives and fathered approximately 50 children. Osama was one of the youngest of the elder sons. His mother, Hamida al-Attaz, was Muhammad's 10th or 11th wife, a Syrian woman who had been divorced or separated from the patriarch relatively early. Some accounts suggest that Osama occupied a slightly outsider position within the sprawling family, deeply connected to the wealth and prestige of the bin Laden name, but not at the inner circle of the most favored sons. In 1967, when Osama was roughly 10 years old, his father died in a plane crash. The family business was transferred into a trust and managed collectively, but the absence of that founding patriarch, the man who had built an empire from nothing, is worth noting. In the biographical accounts of those who knew the young Osama, what consistently emerges is a portrait of a quiet, serious, deeply religious young man who was searching, even in adolescence, for a sense of identity that went beyond inherited wealth. He attended Al-Thajer Model School in Jeddah, an elite institution that served the children of the Saudi establishment. He was, by multiple accounts, studious and reserved. Not charismatic in the way his later public persona might suggest. Methodical. Attentive. The 1970s were a period of profound tension within Saudi Arabia. The oil boom had brought enormous wealth, but it had also brought rapid modernization, Western cultural influence, and a kind of social vertigo that deeply unsettled conservative religious scholars. For a young man of Osama's temperament, drawn to order, to moral clarity, to the idea that history could be navigated by fixed spiritual principles, this era of contradiction was formative. He entered King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah to study economics and business administration. Fitting, given the family business. But the most significant education he received at university was not in economics. It was ideological. At King Abdulaziz University, Osama encountered the intellectual currents of political Islam that were reshaping the Muslim world. He came into contact with the ideas of thinkers like Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian scholar whose writings, especially the Manifesto Milestones, had provided the intellectual framework for an entire generation of Islamist political movements. Qutb's argument was stark. The modern world, including the governments of Muslim-majority nations, had fallen into a state of jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance and moral disorder. The duty of true believers, Qutb argued, was not simply to practice Islam privately, but to actively confront and dismantle these corrupt systems. These ideas did not transform Osama overnight, but they planted seeds in fertile ground. He also encountered, during this period, the influence of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian scholar and theologian who would later become perhaps the single most important intellectual figure in his radicalization. Azzam was a professor at King Abdulaziz University, and the relationship he developed with Osama bin Laden was, by all serious accounts, that of mentor and student. Azzam believed, with missionary conviction, that armed jihad in defense of Muslim lands was not merely permissible but obligatory, a personal religious duty for every able Muslim. And then, in 1979, the world gave Abdullah Azzam, and his student, exactly the cause they had been waiting for. December 24, 1979. Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan, beginning an occupation that would last nearly a decade and kill more than 1 million Afghan civilians. The invasion was framed by Soviet leadership as a response to instability in a neighboring socialist state. The rest of the world, particularly the United States and the conservative Muslim world, saw it through an entirely different lens. For the Carter administration in Washington, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan represented the most aggressive Soviet territorial expansion since World War II. For the Saudi royal family and their religious establishment, it represented something equally alarming, a godless communist superpower occupying a Muslim land. These two very different geopolitical anxieties would converge in a covert operation that would, with terrible irony, help produce the very threat it was meant to counter. The CIA, working with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, began funneling money, weapons, and training to Afghan resistance fighters, collectively called the Mujahideen. Saudi Arabia, with American encouragement, matched American funding dollar for dollar. By the mid-1980s, hundreds of millions of dollars per year were flowing into the Afghan resistance. It was one of the largest covert operations in CIA history. But there was another dimension to this effort, one that operated alongside the state-sponsored military operation. Religious volunteers from across the Muslim world began traveling to Pakistan and Afghanistan to join the fight. Recruitment networks emerged in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Algeria. Young men who had absorbed the ideas of Qutb and Azzam, that jihad was a personal obligation, now had a specific place to go and a specific enemy to fight. Osama bin Laden was 22 years old when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. By most accounts, he was not immediately swept into the conflict. He graduated from King Abdulaziz University and spent some time working in the family business. But the pull of what was happening in Afghanistan, amplified by his mentor Abdullah Azzam, was irresistible. By 1984, bin Laden was in Peshawar, Pakistan, the staging ground for the Afghan resistance. He was not, at this stage, a military commander or a strategist. What he brought was money, organizational capacity, and a last name that opened doors in the Gulf fundraising networks. Working with Azzam, he co-founded an organization called the Maktab al-Khidmat, the Afghan Services Bureau, which functioned as a recruitment and logistics operation, channeling Arab volunteers into the Afghan conflict. It was in this environment, the crucible of the Afghan War, the camps, the ideology, the international network of volunteers, that Osama bin Laden was transformed from a wealthy donor and logistics organizer into something else. He traveled to Afghanistan multiple times during the 1980s. He lived in the field. By some accounts, he came under direct fire during engagements with Soviet forces, particularly at the Battle of Jaji in 1987, an encounter that became heavily mythologized in subsequent years, particularly by bin Laden himself, who cited it as a defining moment. Whether or not the Battle of Jaji was as significant as claimed is, analytically speaking, less important than what it represented: the construction of a personal narrative. Bin Laden was building a story about himself, a story of sacrifice, of religious conviction, of a man who had abandoned comfort for principle. This narrative would become one of his most effective recruiting tools. The ideological foundation being laid during this period is critical to understand. Abdullah Azzam's contribution was to transform the concept of jihad from a defensive, collective obligation governed by state authorities into an individual religious duty, something every Muslim could and should pursue independently. His famous formulation, "Jihad and the rifle alone, no negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogues," was not a fringe position at the time. It circulated widely in religious circles across the Muslim world. But bin Laden was beginning to extend Azzam's framework in a direction that would eventually put them in direct conflict. Azzam saw the Afghan jihad as the beginning of a project of Muslim liberation, starting with Afghanistan, then moving to reclaim Palestine and other Muslim lands from occupying forces. His vision was, in a certain sense, still geographically bounded. Bin Laden was thinking differently. And in 1988, the divergence became structural. The word Al-Qaeda translates, approximately, as the base or the foundation. Its origins are more prosaic than the organization's eventual reputation suggests. In 1988, as it became clear that the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was imminent, a meeting took place in Peshawar. Bin Laden and a small group of associates, including key figures like Mohammed Atef and Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, began discussing what would come next for the network of Arab fighters that had been assembled over nearly a decade of war. The Soviet-Afghan War had produced something unprecedented, a transnational network of trained, ideologically committed fighters with combat experience, international connections, and, crucially, a sense that they had defeated a superpower. This last point is analytically significant and is often underappreciated. The narrative that took hold among these men was not simply that the Mujahideen had won. It was that they had won, that a committed group of believers, armed with faith and willingness to sacrifice, could face a modern military machine and prevail. This belief would prove catastrophically consequential. Al-Qaeda was formally established in August 1988. Its initial structure included a Shura Council, an advisory body, with bin Laden as the emir, or leader. The organization's founding documents, recovered years later, reveal a surprisingly bureaucratic institution. There were formal membership applications, salary structures, benefit packages for families of members killed in operations. This was not a loose affiliation of zealots. It was, from the beginning, designed to function as an organization. But here is the critical analytical point. Al-Qaeda was never primarily a military organization in the conventional sense. It was, from its inception, primarily an ideological and logistical platform. Its most important function was not to field armies but to inspire, finance, train, and connect individuals and smaller groups who could carry out operations on behalf of a shared ideology. This distinction matters enormously when trying to understand both what Al-Qaeda was and why it proved so difficult to defeat. You cannot bomb an idea. You cannot arrest a network that has no fixed address. In November 1989, Abdullah Azzam was killed by a car bomb in Peshawar. The assassination has never been definitively attributed, and numerous theories persist, including suggestions of involvement by Pakistani intelligence, Egyptian intelligence, and even, according to some analysts, elements within Al-Qaeda itself who saw Azzam's more limited vision as an obstacle to bin Laden's expanding ambitions. The truth remains contested. What is not contested is that after Azzam's death, The intellectual direction of the organization shifted decisively toward the harder, more expansive vision that bin Laden and Egyptian ideologue Ayman al-Zawahiri were developing. Al-Zawahiri, who led Egyptian Islamic Jihad before merging his organization with al-Qaeda, was in many respects the intellectual architect of the ideology that would define the organization. If Azam had taught bin Laden that jihad was a duty, al-Zawahiri provided the strategic argument for why the far enemy, the United States and Western powers, had to be targeted directly, not merely the near enemy of corrupt Muslim governments. This strategic pivot, from regional to global, is the most consequential intellectual development in the history of al-Qaeda. And it took place not in a cave, but in the operational planning rooms of an organization that was, at this point, already moving into a new phase. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, home to its two holiest sites, requested military assistance from the United States. American troops arrived and were stationed on Saudi soil. For Osama bin Laden, who had reportedly offered to mobilize Afghan war veterans to defend the kingdom and been refused, this was a moment of profound rupture. The presence of non-Muslim military forces on the Arabian Peninsula, in the land of the two holy mosques, as bin Laden would repeatedly phrase it, became the central grievance around which he would organize his subsequent career. Whether this grievance was sincerely felt or strategically cultivated is, in some respects, a false distinction. It was both. It was real, it was powerful, and it was communicable to a vast audience. After the Gulf War, bin Laden's relationship with the Saudi government deteriorated irreparably. His Saudi citizenship was eventually revoked in 1994. He had already, by 1991 or 1992, relocated to Sudan, where the government of Omar al-Bashir and the Islamist ideologue Hassan al-Turabi offered him shelter and operational space. He spent roughly 5 years in Sudan, during which al-Qaeda continued to develop its infrastructure, training networks, and planning capacity. It was during this period that the organization began moving from ideology to operation. The first significant attacks attributable to al-Qaeda or its affiliated networks began to emerge. In 1992, bombings targeted hotels in Aden, Yemen, that American troops were using as a transit point during a humanitarian mission to Somalia. The bombs killed 2 Austrian tourists. The attacks were largely overlooked by the Western public. The Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993 was primarily the work of Somali militia forces loyal to Mohammed Farah aided. But bin Laden later claimed that al-Qaeda had provided training to Somali fighters. The degree of direct operational involvement is disputed among analysts and historians. What is analytically important is how bin Laden interpreted the American withdrawal from Somalia that followed, as proof that the United States, beneath its military power, lacked the will to absorb casualties. This reading of American psychology would shape his strategic thinking for the next decade. In February 1993, a truck bomb detonated in the underground parking garage of the World Trade Center in New York City, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000. The perpetrators were linked to a network connected to figures in bin Laden's orbit, though the direct organizational connection to al-Qaeda leadership remained murky. The FBI investigation identified Ramzi Youssef, a Pakistani militant with ties to al-Qaeda, as the primary architect. These events were escalating in severity, geographic reach, and organizational sophistication. But the United States government, the intelligence community, and the public had not yet fully registered what was building. In 1996, under American and Saudi pressure, Sudan expelled bin Laden. He returned to Afghanistan, where the Taliban, a movement of Pashtun religious students that had emerged from the chaos of post-Soviet Afghanistan, had taken control of most of the country. The Taliban provided bin Laden and al-Qaeda with something they had not had in Sudan, a genuine state sponsor. A physical territory in which to operate, train, and plan with minimal external interference. In August 1996, from his base in Afghanistan, bin Laden issued his first formal declaration of war against the United States and its allies, a document titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. It was explicit, lengthy, and largely ignored by the major powers. In February 1998, he went further, issuing a fatwa, co-signed by al-Zawahiri and several other figures, declaring that killing Americans, civilian or military, was an individual religious duty for every Muslim. This document was, legally and theologically speaking, entirely without legitimate authority. A fatwa of this kind requires scholarly credentials and institutional standing that none of the signatories possessed. But it was distributed, translated, and published. And then, in August 1998, Al-Qaeda demonstrated that these were not empty declarations. On August 7, 1998, the 8th anniversary of the arrival of American forces in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, truck bombs exploded nearly simultaneously outside the United States embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The Nairobi bombing killed 213 people, the vast majority of them Kenyan civilians working in or near the building. The Dar es Salaam bombing killed 11. More than 5,000 people were injured across both attacks. These were not military targets. The dead were office workers, passers-by, people at bus stops. The Clinton administration responded with cruise missile strikes on al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and, in a decision later widely criticized, on a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, which was alleged to have been producing chemical weapons precursors. The evidence for the pharmaceutical factory's role was, by subsequent analysis, weak. The missiles largely missed their targets in Afghanistan. The message sent was one of reactive imprecision. In October 2000, a suicide bombing carried out by al-Qaeda operatives against the USS Cole in Aden Harbor killed 17 American sailors and injured 39. The attack demonstrated a level of operational planning, including months of surveillance and a custom-built explosive device, that indicated a mature, patient, and capable organization. The question that investigators and analysts found themselves asking was not whether al-Qaeda was dangerous. It was, what was it building toward? What came after Nairobi? After the Cole? The answer was already in motion. September 11, 2001 stands as the single most consequential act of terrorism in recorded history. Not primarily because of its death toll, though 2,977 people lost their lives, but because of the cascade of geopolitical, legal, social, and psychological consequences it set in motion that continue to shape the world today. The operation, known internally within al-Qaeda as the Plains Operation or Holy Tuesday, was years in the planning. Bin Laden had reportedly conceived of a large-scale attack using hijacked commercial aircraft as early as 1996. The operational planning was largely delegated to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a Kuwaiti-Pakistani militant who had first proposed the concept and who became the operation's field organizer. The Hamburg Cell, a group of Arab students based in Germany, including Mohammed Atta, who would become the tactical lead, became central to the operation's execution. The planning documents and interrogation records reviewed by the 9/11 Commission reveal an operation that was both more sophisticated and more improvised than popular imagination often suggests. Al-Qaeda provided the funding, an estimated $400,000 to $500,000 in total, training, and some operational guidance. But the specific execution relied heavily on the judgment and initiative of the operatives on the ground. This hybrid model, centralized ideology and financing, decentralized execution, was a deliberate structural choice, and it is one that counterterrorism agencies are still grappling with today. The immediate human toll was devastating. Nearly 3,000 people died, from more than 90 countries. Firefighters, office workers, flight crews, first responders who ran toward the danger. The attack destroyed the World Trade Center, damaged the Pentagon, and was foiled, at the cost of all passengers and crew, over a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The world's immediate response was, genuinely, one of solidarity. NATO invoked Article 5, collective defense, for the first time in its history. France's newspaper Le Monde ran a headline translating as, "We are all Americans." Governments across the political and religious spectrum condemned the attacks. Even leaders in Palestinian territories expressed condolences. But the solidarity was, in significant measure, short-lived. What followed would prove as consequential as the attacks themselves. The administration of President George W. Bush responded to September 11th with a declaration of what it called the War on Terror, a framing that was politically powerful but analytically complex. Wars are fought against states or specific armed groups with definable boundaries. Terror is a tactic, not an enemy. The conflation of these two concepts would produce, over the following 2 decades, a series of policy decisions whose consequences continue to generate serious debate among historians, legal scholars, and security analysts. In October 2001, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, invading Afghanistan with the stated objectives of dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban government that sheltered them. Within months, the Taliban had been driven from the major cities. By December 2001, Kabul had fallen. But in December 2001, at the complex of caves and tunnels in the Tora Bora Mountains near the Afghan-Pakistani border, something went wrong. Or rather, something did not go right. U.S. forces, relying heavily on Afghan proxy fighters rather than American ground troops to close the escape routes, allowed a significant window of opportunity. Bin Laden escaped. The precise details remain partially classified and partially disputed. What is not in serious dispute is that the primary target of the entire operation disappeared into the mountains, and would not be found for nearly 10 years. In March 2003, the United States and a coalition of allies invaded Iraq, a decision that is now among the most extensively analyzed and debated foreign policy choices in modern history. The stated justification, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had connections to al-Qaeda, was not supported by the evidence available at the time, as multiple subsequent investigations confirmed. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The connection between Saddam Hussein's secular Ba'athist government and al-Qaeda's religiously motivated network was, at most, tangential. The Iraq War did not reduce al-Qaeda's influence. It amplified it. The power vacuum created by the removal of the Iraqi state, the dismantling of the Iraqi army, and the subsequent sectarian conflict provided precisely the conditions in which jihadist networks could recruit, organize, and operate. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a franchise organization led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi that adopted bin Laden's name and ideology but operated largely independently, emerged from this chaos and would eventually evolve into the Islamic State, or ISIS. From late 2001 until May 2011, nearly a decade, Osama bin Laden evaded the most intensive manhunt in the history of American intelligence. The United States spent billions of dollars, deployed thousands of personnel across multiple agencies, and offered a $25 million reward for information leading to his capture. He was not found. How? The question is not merely operational. It is a window into the nature of the pursuit itself. The answer involves a combination of factors: the terrain, the cultural dynamics of the Afghan-Pakistani border region, the limits of technical surveillance in a pre-smartphone environment, the organizational choices bin Laden himself made, and, critically, the degree to which elements within Pakistan's security establishment were complicit, indifferent, or simply unable to act effectively. That last point remains one of the most sensitive and contested aspects of the entire episode. In the years immediately following Tora Bora, the working assumption of many intelligence analysts was that bin Laden was moving through the tribal areas of Pakistan. The FATA, a semi-autonomous belt of territory along the Afghan border with its own legal and administrative frameworks, deeply resistant to outside authority. The CIA's Counterterrorism Center had a dedicated unit, known informally as Alex Station, that had been tracking bin Laden since the late 1990s and continued to do so with fierce intensity. But they were looking for a man who had learned, in the mountains of Afghanistan, how to be invisible. Bin Laden's communications discipline during this period was extraordinary by the standards of a man running a global organization. After 2001, he essentially stopped using electronic communications. No satellite phones. No email. No digital footprint that signals intelligence could reliably track. He communicated through a network of human couriers, face-to-face messages, hand-carried documents, a system of intermediaries that was slow, cumbersome, and very difficult to penetrate. Al-Qaeda as a centralized operational organization was significantly degraded during the years of hiding. Key figures were killed or captured in drone strikes, special operations raids, and intelligence operations. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured in Pakistan in 2003. Abu Faraj al-Libi was captured in 2005. The organization's ability to plan and execute complex, centrally coordinated attacks was substantially reduced. But here is the critical analytical distinction. Al-Qaeda as an ideology and a brand was not degraded. If anything, the Iraq War and the broader conduct of the War on Terror, including the images from Abu Ghraib, the controversy over Guantanamo Bay, the civilian casualties from drone strikes, provided ongoing recruitment material that offset, at least partially, the operational losses the organization was suffering. Bin Laden continued to communicate with the world through periodic video and audio messages, released through Al-Qaeda's media operation Al-Sahab. These messages served multiple functions simultaneously. They demonstrated he was alive. They maintained his relevance as a symbolic figure for the movement. They responded to current events, the Iraq War, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Danish cartoon controversy, in ways that showed an organization still engaged with the world even while its leader lived as a fugitive. The content of these messages was, analytically speaking, more interesting than their surface provocation suggests. Bin Laden repeatedly demonstrated familiarity with Western political discourse. He referenced prominent American intellectual figures and polling data on American public opinion. He was not speaking only to his existing followers. He was attempting to insert himself into the broader global conversation about American foreign policy. The breakthrough, when it eventually came, did not come from satellites or intercepted communications. It came from a single thread pulled at the right time, the identity of a courier. The city of Abbottabad, in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, is a mid-sized urban center about 75 miles north of Islamabad. It has a military academy, a university, middle-class residential neighborhoods. It is, in almost every respect, unremarkable. The compound at the center of this story was built around 2005. It sat in a neighborhood called Bilal Town. Its walls were 12 to 18 feet high, significantly taller than anything in the surrounding area. It had no internet connection and no phone line. Residents burned their trash rather than leaving it for collection. 2 families lived there and declined to discuss their circumstances with neighbors. CIA analysts who began studying the compound from satellite imagery starting around 2010 identified a specific anomaly, a third family whose members never left the compound. An unidentified tall man who was sometimes glimpsed walking in the compound's courtyard but was never seen outside. The profile fit what analysts knew of bin Laden's operational security. The intelligence case was built painstakingly over the following months. By early 2011, the CIA's assessment, communicated to President Barack Obama, was that there was a strong possibility, though not certainty, that Osama bin Laden was living in the Abbottabad compound. The estimate of probability given to the president varied depending on which analyst was asked. Some believed the case was highly compelling. Others were more cautious, haunted by the memory of the faulty intelligence that had preceded the Iraq War. President Obama convened multiple meetings of his national security team. The options presented included a drone strike, a joint operation with Pakistani forces, and a unilateral American raid. A drone strike would reduce risk to American personnel but would leave no physical proof of the outcome. A joint operation with Pakistan raised questions about operational security. Specifically, the risk that elements within Pakistani intelligence might warn the compound's occupants. The unilateral raid was the highest risk option for American personnel, but offered the best chance of confirmation. On April 29, 2011, President Obama authorized the operation. On the night of May 1 to 2, 2011, in Pakistan, it was already May 2. A team of Navy SEALs from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group flew from a base in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, via 2 stealth Black Hawk helicopters. One helicopter experienced an aerodynamic problem during the approach and was forced to make a hard landing inside the compound wall. No crew members were seriously injured. The team continued the operation on the modified timeline the situation demanded. The operation lasted approximately 40 minutes. Bin Laden was found on the compound's 3rd floor. He was shot and killed. 4 others were killed during the operation, including a courier identified as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the very individual whose identity had been the thread that led CIA analysts to the compound in the first place. No American personnel were killed. At approximately 11:35 p.m. Eastern Time, President Obama addressed the nation. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. Crowds gathered spontaneously outside the White House. At Ground Zero in New York. In Times Square. The geopolitical reaction was more complex. Pakistan's government expressed deep displeasure at the unilateral violation of its sovereignty. Questions were raised, and remain partially unresolved, about how a figure of bin Laden's profile could have lived, apparently undisturbed, less than a mile from Pakistan's premier military academy for what evidence suggested was several years. Bin Laden's body was washed, wrapped in a white sheet in accordance with Islamic tradition, and buried at sea from the USS Carl Vinson in the North Arabian Sea. The decision not to provide a land burial was specifically intended to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine or pilgrimage site. He was 54 years old. To understand what Osama bin Laden believed, and why those beliefs proved capable of motivating others, requires stepping outside the framework of simple condemnation, which, however justified morally, does not explain anything, and into the more demanding work of ideological analysis. This is not an exercise in sympathy. It is an exercise in diagnosis. Bin Laden's worldview drew from several distinct intellectual streams that converged in a specific historical moment. The first stream was Salafism, a theological orientation within Sunni Islam that emphasizes a return to the practices and beliefs of the earliest Muslim community, the Salaf al-Salih, or pious predecessors. Salafism is, in most of its forms, a theological orientation with no necessary connection to violence. The vast majority of people who identify with Salafi principles are not violent. This distinction is not merely courtesy. It is analytically essential. What bin Laden layered onto this Salafi theological foundation was a set of political arguments drawn from thinkers like Ibn Taymiyyah, a medieval Islamic scholar whose writings have been extensively cited by jihadist movements, and, most importantly, Sayyid Qutb. Qutb's concept of Jahiliyyah, the claim that Muslim societies had fallen into a state of pre-Islamic ignorance, provided the moral justification for attacking not only non-Muslim governments but even the governments of Muslim-majority states that Qutb deemed insufficiently Islamic. Al-Zawahiri sharpened this into a specific strategic theory, that the near enemy, Muslim governments sustained by Western support, could not be overthrown without first defeating the far enemy, specifically the United States, whose military and economic power sustained these governments. Attack America directly, the theory argued, and you force the apostate regimes of the Muslim world to face their own populations without external protection. This is not Islamic theology. Let that be stated clearly and emphatically. The overwhelming consensus of Islamic religious scholarship, across traditions, geographies, and centuries, has consistently rejected the idea that deliberate attacks on civilians constitute legitimate jihad. The legal framework of classical Islamic jurisprudence governing warfare imposes strict obligations of distinction between combatants and non-combatants, proportionality in the use of force, and prohibitions on the targeting of women, children, and non-combatants. Bin Laden's response to these objections was to redefine the category of civilian in ways that no mainstream Islamic legal tradition would recognize. American civilians, he argued, were collectively responsible for the actions of their government. Their taxes funded the military. Their votes sustained the political system. Therefore, they were, in his framing, legitimate targets. This argument is a deliberate distortion of classical legal categories, one that has been rejected by virtually every significant Islamic scholarly body in the world, including scholars who hold deeply conservative theological positions. This matters not only as a matter of intellectual honesty but because bin Laden's message was most effective not among deeply learned religious scholars but among educated young men who felt the combination of Western cultural influence, corrupt local governance, foreign military presence, and the perceived humiliation of Muslim political weakness as a profound personal grievance. He was not offering theology. He was offering agency, the sense that action was possible, that the moral framework for that action had been articulated, and that there was an organization capable of executing it. The sociological profile of al-Qaeda recruits and of those radicalized by bin Laden's messaging does not support a picture of desperate, uneducated, impoverished individuals with no other options. Research by sociologists, including Mark Sageman, reveals a more complicated picture. Many were educated, some were professionals, a significant number came from stable middle-class backgrounds. The radicalization process was, in many cases, as much about social identity and group belonging as it was about theological conviction. Bin Laden understood, with remarkable early clarity, that the mass media environment of the late 20th and early 21st centuries could function as a force multiplier for a relatively small organization. The September 11th attacks were designed, in part, to generate the maximum amount of media coverage. Bin Laden later said, in a recording that was widely authenticated, that even he had not fully anticipated how comprehensively the attacks would be covered on global television. This is one of the deepest and most uncomfortable analytical legacies of al-Qaeda's strategy. The recognition that in an era of 24-hour news and instant global communication, even a relatively small organization can generate effects wildly disproportionate to its actual military capacity, simply by choosing targets and methods that guarantee saturation media coverage. The contradiction at the heart of bin Laden's personal narrative is worth dwelling on, because it tells us something important about the psychology of ideologically motivated violence. He was a wealthy man who claimed to fight against wealth and Western materialism. He was an educated product of the modern world who preached a return to a medieval interpretation of social order. He was a man who sent others to die while carefully preserving his own life through sophisticated operational security. These contradictions were not secret, they were visible to anyone paying attention. And yet they did not fundamentally undermine his appeal to his audience. Why? Because the appeal was never purely logical. It was emotional, moral, and existential. The question bin Laden was answering for his audience was not, what is the most rational response to our political situation? It was, who are we? What do we stand for? And what are we willing to do about what is being done to us? When ideology provides compelling answers to those questions, factual inconsistencies in the person offering the answers often matter less than we would like them to. To assess the legacy of Osama bin Laden is not to complete a story. It is to map an ongoing process of consequence, one that has touched virtually every aspect of international life, from the architecture of airports to the legal frameworks governing surveillance to the political map of the Middle East. Begin with security and civil liberties, because this is where the impact is most immediately tangible to ordinary citizens in democratic societies. In the United States, the USA Patriot Act, passed just 45 days after September 11th, dramatically expanded the government's surveillance and law enforcement powers. Section 215 of the Act allowed the FBI to compel the production of any tangible thing in connection with terrorism investigations. This provision was later used, as documents released by Edward Snowden in 2013 revealed, to justify the bulk collection of phone records of millions of Americans who had no connection to any terrorism investigation whatsoever. The revelations of the NSA's mass surveillance programs, PRISM, X-Keyscore, and others, sparked a global debate about the appropriate balance between security and privacy that has not been resolved. Courts in multiple countries subsequently ruled that programs instituted in the name of counter-terrorism violated existing legal protections. The legal and constitutional landscape governing digital surveillance was fundamentally altered, and the debates it generated continue to run through the politics of every major democracy. The transformation of air travel is perhaps the most universally experienced change. Before September 11th, airport security in the United States was primarily focused on preventing conventional hijackings, scenarios in which hijackers would take passengers hostage to achieve political goals. The security architecture assumed that hijackers wanted to live. September 11th revealed the assumption's fatal flaw. The subsequent transformation of airport security, full body scanners, the liquids ban, the requirement to remove shoes, are not simply inconveniences. They are daily embodied reminders of a specific historical event, written into the routines of billions of annual air travelers. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq produced consequences of staggering scale and still debated legitimacy. The Afghan War lasted 20 years, from October 2001 to August 2021. The United States spent more than $2 trillion on the conflict. More than 170,000 people were killed in the war, including over 40,000 Afghan civilians, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. The NATO-backed Afghan government collapsed in August 2021 as American forces completed their withdrawal, and the Taliban returned to power in Kabul, the same group that had been removed from power 20 years earlier at the start of the war. The long-term consequences for Afghan civilians, particularly women, whose access to education, employment, and basic freedoms were dramatically curtailed under Taliban rule, represent one of the most tragic dimensions of this entire history. The Iraq War, by almost any metric, produced more destruction than it prevented. The death toll of Iraqi civilians from the 2003 invasion and subsequent insurgency and civil war is estimated, depending on methodology, at somewhere between 150,000 and over 1 million people. The dismantling of Iraqi state institutions created a power vacuum that was filled, in significant part, by al-Qaeda in Iraq and its successor organization, the Islamic State. A war justified partly on the basis of preventing terrorism produced, in practice, a substantial expansion of the very forces it was meant to defeat. The emergence of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, represents one of the most direct and consequential legacy effects of the chain of events that bin Laden set in motion. ISIS drew from al-Qaeda's ideological framework while radicalizing it further, rejecting bin Laden's strategic focus on attacking the far enemy in favor of immediate territorial conquest and the brutal application of what they claimed was Islamic governance. By 2014, ISIS controlled territory the size of the United Kingdom, with a population of roughly 8 million people. Its campaign of atrocity represented a new dimension in the evolution of the jihadist movement. The geopolitical consequences of the post-September 11 decade were global and multidimensional. The deep rift between the United States and its European allies over the Iraq War, particularly the positions of France and Germany, which refused to endorse the invasion, represented one of the most significant fractures within the Western alliance since the Suez Crisis of 1956. The war damaged American credibility in international institutions in ways that took years, and arguably are still being repaired. Relationships between Muslim-majority communities and Western governments were profoundly complicated. The framing of the War on Terror as a civilizational conflict, which responsible policymakers largely tried to avoid but which filtered into public discourse nonetheless, generated suspicion, discrimination, and alienation within Muslim communities in Europe and North America. This alienation created, paradoxically, conditions in which extremist recruiters found more fertile ground, not because most Muslims sympathized with al-Qaeda's violence, which they categorically did not, but because the experience of being collectively suspected based on religious identity is a powerful grievance that extremist groups are skilled at exploiting. The normalization of drone warfare as an instrument of counterterrorism policy represents one of the most significant and contested legal and ethical legacies of the post-September 11 era. By the time of bin Laden's death, the United States had conducted hundreds of drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and other countries, often targeting individuals who had never been charged with a crime, in countries with which the United States was not formally at war. The legal framework justifying these strikes, the authorization for use of military force passed by Congress 3 days after September 11, 2001, was a broadly worded document that has been stretched, by successive administrations, far beyond what its authors almost certainly contemplated. And what of the specific organization that bin Laden built? Al-Qaeda Central, the core organization in Afghanistan and Pakistan, was significantly degraded over the 2 decades following September 11. Key leaders were killed or captured. Operational capacity was substantially reduced. Bin Laden himself spent his final years cut off from day-to-day operational command, limited in his ability to guide the organization's activities. But the franchise model that al-Qaeda had developed meant that its effective demise as a centralized organization did not mean the end of the movement it represented. Al-Qaeda affiliates, in Yemen, AQAP, in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, in Syria, continued to operate, recruit, and carry out attacks. The academic field of terrorism studies was itself transformed by September 11. Scholars, historians, political scientists, and psychologists produced an enormous body of work attempting to understand radicalization, de-radicalization, the sociology of extremist movements, and the effectiveness of various counterterrorism strategies. What the research generally suggests is that the factors producing radicalization are not primarily theological but social and political, and that effective prevention requires addressing grievances, building social cohesion, and creating credible alternative narratives, not simply suppressing ideology by force. Osama bin Laden believed, and stated explicitly, that he was setting in motion a historical process that would end with the collapse of American power and the establishment of a new Islamic caliphate across the Muslim world. By any objective assessment, that project failed. American power was not collapsed. No caliphate, however horrifyingly ISIS attempted to create one, has proven sustainable or legitimate. The overwhelming majority of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims rejected, and continue to reject, the ideology and methods of al-Qaeda and its successors. But this failure does not mean the attacks had no effect. The world that exists today, its surveillance infrastructure, its foreign policy posture, its patterns of conflict, its civil liberties debates, its relationship between security and democracy, was substantially shaped by a set of choices made in the caves of Afghanistan, the apartments of Hamburg, and the compound in Abbottabad. The deepest question raised by the history of Osama bin Laden is not whether he was evil, a word that, however accurate in moral terms, ends analysis rather than advancing it. The deeper question is, how does a world organized around the presumption of state sovereignty, international law, and the protection of civilian life respond to a threat that operates outside all those frameworks? That question does not have a clean answer. The wars undertaken in response to September 11 did not provide one. The legal frameworks stretched to authorize them did not provide one. The intelligence failures and successes that punctuated 20 years of pursuit did not provide one. What history, this specific history, provides is not a solution. It provides a record. of what a single organization, animated by a specific ideology, can do to the international order, of how states respond when confronted with terror, of the cascading consequences that follow when those responses themselves generate new grievances, new recruits, and new cycles of violence. Osama bin Laden died as he had lived for his final decade, in a compound, behind high walls, cut off from the organization he had built, communicating with a world he could no longer directly touch. The man who had sought to remake the global order spent his last years watching television, tending a vegetable garden, and reviewing Al-Qaeda's communications in the hope of maintaining relevance from behind the walls of a Pakistani safehouse. None of the nearly 3,000 people who died on September 11, 2001 had any part in the political grievances that bin Laden claimed to be acting upon. They were not symbols. They were not combatants. They were people who went to work, or boarded an aircraft, or ran into a burning building to help others. Their deaths were not the opening of a new chapter in a righteous historical struggle. They were a crime, against individuals, against the communities that lost them, and against the principles that make civilized collective life possible. That is the beginning and the end of the moral accounting. The history that surrounds it, the causes, the consequences, the failures of intelligence and policy, the long wars and their costs, is complex, contested, and still unfolding. The only way to prevent violent extremism is to understand it, not to excuse it, not to amplify it, but to understand it with the same rigor and honesty we apply to any other challenge that threatens human civilization. Paraphrased from the 9/11 Commission Report, 2004.